The heavy glass doors of Manhattan's newest luxury steakhouse had barely swung open when my husband made sure I felt completely invisible. Derek stood on the red carpet under the flashing lights of Forbes food reporters, his arm wrapped tightly around Simone, his new head chef, and, as I had recently discovered, the woman he'd been seeing behind my back for the better part of a year. He looked at the cameras and smiled that perfect, practiced smile that had fooled me for 2 decades. He told the reporters that he had poured his absolute soul into Prime and Vine, calling this flagship location the ultimate realization of his personal vision. Then he introduced Simone as the genius who had brought that vision to life. The crowd applauded. I stood just outside the velvet ropes wearing a simple tailored wool coat, my expression calm, cold, and entirely unbothered as I stepped forward. I walked onto the carpet, heading toward the entrance I had spent the last 14 months designing. Every single detail of this location, from the imported limestone facade to the custom brass fixtures, had passed through my hands while Derek was busy taking credit at cocktail parties. Derek saw me instantly, and his smile flickered. He signaled the head of security and intercepted me before I could reach the door, telling me not to ruin his night and ordering security to escort me out because I didn't have an invitation. Simone looked at me with a fake, pitying smirk, telling me this was an exclusive event for high-tier investors and that my level was more like a fast food franchise on the edge of town. Several reporters noticed the tension and turned their cameras toward us. Derek adjusted his cufflinks, looked down his nose at me and said, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, that I belonged to the past. Oh, he told me my only talent had ever been hiding in the back office, playing with spreadsheets and basic bookkeeping, and told me to go home because I didn't belong there. I took a slow, quiet breath. The cameras were recording every second. I looked him straight in the eye and told him he was right about the spreadsheets. I told him I especially loved the ones that tracked corporate property deeds. I said I hadn't come for the free champagne. I'd come to let him know that my holding company had terminated the commercial master lease on this building at 9 o'clock that morning. Derek's face froze instantly and Simone's smirk dropped. I told them they had exactly 24 hours to pack up their personal knives and vacate my property. 6 months earlier, I never could have imagined standing on Fifth Avenue saying those words. Back then, I was still trying to save a marriage that had quietly died years before I even realized it. People always ask when a partnership or a marriage actually ends. It's never one big explosion. It's hundreds of small, quiet moments of disrespect, stacked one on top of another until the weight becomes unbearable. I remembered sitting at our cramped kitchen table in Brooklyn 9 years earlier. The apartment was dark and smelled faintly of old cooking grease from the diner downstairs. Derek was sweating, running his hands through his hair in a panic, surrounded by unpaid invoices. He told me the meat suppliers were threatening to cut us off, that the bank wouldn't extend our line of credit, and that we were about to lose everything we'd sunk into our first tiny restaurant. Our daughter, barely 2 years old, was asleep in a bassinet a few feet away. I didn't panic. I quietly slid a cashier's check across the table. I told him I'd taken out a second mortgage on my parents' house in Greenwich, Connecticut for $250,000. I told him it would buy us time and that we would survive this together. That money didn't buy us luxury. It bought us survival. And survival eventually grew into Prime and Vine, a small but respected group of 5 upscale restaurants across Manhattan and Westchester County, worth well over $90 million on paper by the time this story reaches its true beginning. But as the company grew, Derek's memory of who had built it began to shrink. I remembered the New York Hospitality Awards 2 years ago in a glittering ballroom on Park Avenue. Derek stood on stage holding a heavy glass trophy under the spotlight. I sat at a distant table in a dark green dress I'd owned for nearly a decade. Nothing fancy because I'd never cared much for expensive clothes. He stood at the microphone and told the audience he had built this empire from nothing but a dream, that he had risked everything and worked every single day entirely on his own. The crowd roared with applause. Later, in the parking garage, as he unlocked his new luxury car, I told him quietly that he hadn't mentioned our farm suppliers upstate, our kitchen staff, or me. He scoffed, rolled his eyes, and told me not to be insecure. He said I just handled the paperwork and paid the bills, And that, honestly, anyone could do that. He called himself the face of the brand. The only reason people walked through the door and told me I was just a shadow standing quietly in the background. I didn't argue. Arguing had stopped working years earlier. I simply filed that sentence away the way I filed everything else. 2 weeks after that awards banquet, Derek served me with divorce papers. There was no warning, no late night conversation. Just a cold folder laid beside my dinner bowl while I was reheating soup, because my migraine had been bothering me all afternoon. He sighed impatiently and told me we'd essentially been roommates for years anyway. I nodded slowly because that part might even have been true. But roommates don't erase 20 years of another person's life. He leaned against the kitchen counter and told me, quite confidently, that he'd already spoken with his attorney and would make sure I was financially comfortable. Comfortable. After 20 years of pouring my blood, sweat, and savings into a company we were supposed to have built together, I finally looked up and asked him what he genuinely believed I had contributed to this business. He looked almost surprised by the question, as though the answer should have been obvious. He looked me directly in the eye and told me I'd handled spreadsheets. 4 words. Nothing about the personal loans that kept our first restaurant's lights on during 2 recessions. Nothing about the health insurance I'd fought to keep for our kitchen staff when Derek wanted to cut it. Nothing about the nights I'd sat in emergency rooms with line cooks who'd been burned or cut on the job while Derek was out networking with investors. Just 4 words. He picked up his keys, mentioned he had a late dinner meeting, and walked out, leaving me alone at the table until my soup turned completely cold. I wasn't crying. I was simply trying to understand how a person could stand beside me for 2 decades and genuinely believe I'd only ever organized paperwork. 2 days later, I met Naomi Cross for coffee. Naomi had served on our board for nearly 12 years and was one of the only people in my life I still trusted completely. We sat in a quiet cafe near Union Square, away from the noise of the avenue, and she listened without interrupting while I finally said everything out loud. When I finished, she stirred her coffee once, looked directly at me, and asked what I actually wanted. I told her I wanted him to stop pretending I had never existed. Naomi nodded slowly, then asked a question that caught me completely off guard. She asked whether I'd signed this year's corporate voting proxy yet. I blinked. I'd honestly forgotten it even existed. Naomi smiled for the first time all morning. She reached into her leather bag and pulled out a thick corporate binder, telling me I'd remembered exactly when I needed to. She opened it carefully, slid it across the table, and told me to turn to page 31. The page wasn't dramatic. No bold headlines, no clauses highlighted in yellow. Just a chart of names, boxes, and percentages, the kind of dense corporate language I had spent half my adult life quietly reading late at night after Derek had gone to bed. I told her I didn't understand what I was looking at. Naomi turned the binder toward herself and tapped one line with her finger. She reminded me that I personally owned 36% of Prime and Vine's total equity, but told me that wasn't actually the important part. She pointed further down the page and reminded me that my shares, the ones structured as Class A preferred stock, carried 5 votes each compared to a single vote for every ordinary share Derek held. I sat there, frozen, as an old memory surfaced. I remembered my father sitting in our lawyer's office 15 years earlier, insisting on that exact structure before he agreed to co-sign our very first restaurant loan. Naomi leaned back in her chair and said, Derek remembered that structure too once. He'd simply gotten comfortable. For over a decade, every annual shareholders meeting had followed the same quiet routine. A few weeks beforehand, Derek's assistant would email me a standard proxy authorization form. I would sign it without reading it closely. Derek would vote my shares alongside his own. The meeting would end, and life would move on. Somewhere along the way, he had come to believe that arrangement was permanent, a fact of nature rather than a courtesy I extended out of trust. Naomi slid one more document across the table. This year's proxy form. It was completely blank, unsigned. For the first time in 11 years, Derek did not control my votes. She continued gently, reminding me that when my father had guaranteed our very first restaurant loan, he hadn't done it because he trusted Derek's business plan. He'd done it because he trusted me. He used to say that if this company ever survived because of his money and his name on that loan, he wanted everyone someday to remember exactly whose shoulders it had actually been built on. Naomi had been the young associate attorney who drafted that original shareholder agreement. Back then, none of us imagined Prime and Vine would ever be worth more than a modest neighborhood bistro. We were simply trying to keep the lights on. So what happens now? I asked. Naomi didn't answer right away. She folded her hands and asked me why I was asking. I told her I wasn't trying to punish Derek for the affair. She looked relieved and told me that if I had been, she would have advised me to walk away entirely. But if I was trying to protect a company whose leadership had quietly stopped acting in its employees' best interest, she said, that was an entirely different conversation. Over the following weeks, divorce mediation moved forward, reducing 20 years of marriage into folders with colored tabs. Derek was almost cheerful whenever the lawyers were in the room, treating the entire process like a business transaction he had already won. During one session, my parents' old house in Greenwich came up for discussion. It needed serious repairs by then. The roof was failing, and the original windows leaked with every winter storm. Derek barely glanced at the appraisal. He announced he had no interest in maintaining what he called a money pit, and told his attorney he'd happily waive any future claim to it. He looked deeply pleased with himself walking out to the parking lot, telling his lawyer he'd gotten the better deal. He wanted liquidity instead. The downtown penthouse, the brokerage accounts, his boat docked in Montauk. I said nothing. At what used to be our shared apartment, Derek's mother, Patricia, had already started behaving as though I no longer lived there. One Thursday afternoon, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find cardboard boxes lining the front hallway, one labeled in thick black marker, "Donate." Inside sat my parents' wedding photograph, my mother's handwritten recipe cards, and a worn photo album from our very first restaurant, a cramped, rented storefront kitchen in Brooklyn. One photograph of me holding our infant daughter in one arm while taking a supplier call with the other had been bent sharply across the corner. Patricia walked in carrying grocery bags, completely unembarrassed, and told me she figured Derek wouldn't want all that old clutter dragging around forever. I told her my parents weren't clutter. Those photographs were proof that I had been there since the very beginning. Later that evening, while carrying laundry upstairs, I overheard Patricia on the phone in the kitchen talking to Simone. She was telling her how much she'd love the penthouse once they finally remodeled the kitchen and tore out what she called the ancient cabinetry. She wasn't imagining some distant, uncertain future. She was already planning one where I simply didn't exist. The following Monday, my phone rang. Walter Nguyen, our outside accountant, almost never called my personal line directly. His voice sounded unusually serious. He told me he'd been reviewing executive compensation across all 5 Prime and Vine locations and had found several things Naomi needed to see immediately. Large executive retention bonuses approved without full board review. A luxury resort trip to Aspen, categorized on the books as a vendor development conference. A single hotel suite, booked under Derek's name, with no corresponding vendor meetings on record anywhere. And worse, quietly buried in the payroll records, retirement contributions for our hourly kitchen and service staff had been reduced twice in the past year. At the very same time, executive bonuses had increased. When I hung up, I sat alone in the dark kitchen for nearly 20 minutes. I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I was thinking about Gus Ferreira, our longtime maître d', who had been with us since that first cramped Brooklyn storefront, who still showed up at 5 every morning to personally inspect the walk-in coolers before anyone else arrived. If Derek had chosen personal luxury over the retirement security of people like Gus, this had stopped being only about my failed marriage. It had become about protecting the company itself. I didn't call anyone that night. I needed to understand exactly how deep this went before I let it become something that couldn't be quietly undone. The next morning, I drove to Simone's apartment in Long Island City, unannounced. I told myself I wasn't going there for confrontation. I was going because I needed to know whether she understood what she was actually part of. She opened the door in a silk robe, visibly startled, and didn't invite me inside. I asked her plainly whether she knew Derek had reduced retirement contributions for kitchen staff while approving himself 6-figure bonuses. Her expression flickered, just slightly, before she recovered her composure and told me that wasn't her department, that she only handled the menus and the kitchen. I told her that was in some ways the saddest answer she could have given me. I turned and left before she could say anything else. 3 weeks later, Prime and Vine's flagship Manhattan location held its grand opening gala on the same red carpet where this story began. I hadn't been invited, obviously, but I owned the building underneath it. Through a small holding company I'd quietly assembled over the previous 18 months, buying out a struggling landlord's mortgage note at a steep discount, long before Derek ever knew Prime and Vine's flagship lease was even at risk. That was the moment on the carpet. The one Derek and Simone thought was simply a bitter ex-wife making a scene. It was actually the first domino. The morning after that red carpet catastrophe, Derek called an emergency meeting inside Prime and Vine's private upstairs boardroom, trying to secure his final round of expansion funding from Richard Voss, the group's lead outside investor. Derek and Simone sat at the head of the table, forcing polite smiles, trying to frame the previous night's confrontation as nothing more than a minor personal misunderstanding. The door opened and I walked in calmly, Naomi and Walter a step behind me. Derek shot to his feet immediately, slamming his palm against the table, demanding to know what this meant and telling security to remove us. Richard Voss raised one hand, coldly, and told Derek to sit down, informing him that I was there at the board's formal invitation as a 36% shareholder. Naomi slid copies of Walter's forensic compensation summary across the table to every director in the room. Simone's face drained of color as Derek flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with every line. He looked up and glared at me, shouting that this was obviously a setup because of the divorce. Naomi answered calmly that the board's agenda concerned corporate governance, not his marriage. Walter cleared his throat and walked the room through the unauthorized retention bonuses, the mischaracterized resort expenses, and the reduced staff retirement contributions, page by page, number by number. Derek's voice rose in panic. He insisted the bonuses were entirely legal, that Prime and Vine had doubled in value under his leadership alone, that none of this warranted an emergency session. I looked him directly in the eye and told him the company belonged to its shareholders and to the 210 employees across 5 locations who showed up every single morning to actually run it. I reminded him of the recession years, of begging suppliers for another 30 days of credit, of sitting in emergency rooms with burned line cooks while he was out at industry mixers building his personal brand. I told him I had never once asked for credit. I told him I was only asking now for honesty. Naomi placed the first printed resolution in front of every director. It concerned Simone's position as head chef and newly appointed culinary director, recommending immediate administrative leave pending a full internal review of her knowledge of the compensation irregularities. The motion passed unanimously. Simone didn't say a word. She simply gathered her coat and walked out. The second resolution concerned Derek's immediate removal as managing partner and chief executive of Prime and Vine, effective that same afternoon, with Naomi stepping in as interim CEO pending a permanent search. Derek stood so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. He turned to a director he'd known for nearly 15 years, a man who had been at our very first restaurant opening, and asked him quietly not to do this. The director looked down at the table for a long moment, then slowly raised his hand in favor of the motion. One by one, the rest of the hands went up around the table. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just a heavy, exhausted silence. Derek remained standing, his face entirely pale, whispering that we couldn't actually do this to him. Naomi folded the signed resolution and told him quietly that we already had. She slid the final page toward me for the shareholder certification signature. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen, the early arthritis in 2 fingers choosing that exact moment to make itself known, as if reminding me that even this victory came with its own quiet cost. I signed anyway, not out of vengeance, because I wanted the record, finally, to be accurate. A young facilities coordinator knocked softly on the open boardroom door, offering almost apologetically to help Derek collect his personal belongings from his office down the hall. Not security, not humiliation, just a young man doing his job. Somehow that made it sadder than anything else that had happened that morning. An hour later, I walked out of the building alone into the warm Manhattan air. My phone rang. It was my closing attorney, confirming that the legal transfer of my parents' old Greenwich house, the one Derek had waived without a second thought during mediation, had finished processing that same morning. I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. I thought I might finally feel victorious. Instead, I mostly just missed my father and wished he could have seen that the small house he'd once mortgaged everything to protect would still be standing, cared for instead of gutted for its resale value. I drove out to Greenwich that same afternoon to collect one last box of my own belongings from the front hall closet. When I pulled into the driveway, another car was already parked outside. The new owner, a quiet retired schoolteacher named Mr. Alvarez, standing with his realtor near the porch steps. Then a second car pulled up behind mine. Derek climbed out without a word. A moment later, Patricia stepped out through the front door, spotted me immediately, and planted her cane firmly across the walkway. "Don't you ever set foot in this house again," she said, loudly enough that a neighbor across the street glanced over. "Get out." I took one slow breath. "Actually, Patricia," I said, "the sale closed this morning." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "No, it didn't. And Derek is still the CEO of this company." "He isn't," I said quietly. "Not since 10 o'clock this morning." Derek said nothing. For the first time since I had known him, he simply couldn't find a single word. Mr. Alvarez stepped forward gently, holding out the closing documents, introducing himself as the new legal owner. Patricia snatched the papers from his hands, her eyes moving frantically down the page until they landed on the signature line, on Derek's own handwriting from the mediation settlement months earlier, waiving all future claim to the property. Her voice cracked as she looked at her son. She hadn't known. He'd never told her he'd traded away the family home for a penthouse and a boat he could no longer afford to keep. A patrol car rolled up a few minutes later, called by a concerned neighbor. The officer reviewed the paperwork calmly, confirmed the property had changed ownership that morning, and explained politely but firmly that under the settlement terms, Patricia had 72 hours to remove any personal belongings still inside. Nothing more, nothing less. Mr. Alvarez quietly offered to arrange movers if she needed the help. She didn't answer him. She was still staring at her son. I picked up my last box from the front hallway. As I carried it to my car, Derek followed me across the lawn. "Vivian," he said. His voice sounded different now. Not angry, just tired and afraid. "I need you to talk to the board. Fix this." I stopped and looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want your marriage back," I said. "I know," he said quickly. "I want my job." I almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. He still didn't understand what he had actually lost. "I can't help you," I said, and climbed into my car. 3 months later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox, Prime and Vine's annual employee appreciation dinner, held that year at a small event space overlooking the Hudson. I almost didn't go until I noticed a single handwritten line at the bottom of the invitation. "Please come. Naomi." The room was full of people I'd known for 2 decades. Servers who'd started as teenagers and were now managers. Line cooks who'd been promoted to sous chefs. Gus, seated near the front, looking older than I remembered, his hair almost entirely gray now, though his smile hadn't changed at all. He squeezed my hand when I sat down beside him and told me it was good to finally see me smiling again. After dinner, Naomi walked up to a small podium near the windows. The room quieted. A screen behind her lit up with an old photograph. Our very first restaurant. A narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign, Derek standing proudly out front the week we opened, 22 years old and grinning like he'd just won something. Then another photo. Me sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor at midnight, a calculator balanced on one knee, invoices spread across the tile, our daughter asleep in a laundry basket beside me because we couldn't yet afford a crib for the back office. Naomi spoke gently into the microphone. She said that for many years, Prime and Vine's official history had only ever credited one founder. She said that history had always been incomplete. The screen changed to a simple slide with two names side by side: Derek Hale and Vivian Reyes Hale. I heard a chair scrape softly against the floor as someone stood. Then another. Gus was already on his feet, clapping quietly before the rest of the room rose around him. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It didn't need to be. People who had watched me hold this company together for 20 years were simply, finally, allowed to say so out loud. I didn't plan a speech. When Naomi motioned me toward the podium, I only said a few sentences. I told them I had never wanted recognition. I told them I had only ever wanted the truth. I told them this company had never belonged to one person, that it had been built by every server, every cook, every dishwasher who had stayed late without being asked, and by my father, who had once mortgaged everything he owned because he believed in me before anyone else did. I thanked them and sat back down before my voice could break any further. Derek wasn't there that night. I heard later that he'd taken a consulting role at a restaurant group in Miami. Something smaller, quieter, far from any boardroom where his name still carried weight. Simone had left the industry entirely within a month of her administrative leave ending in a quiet, unremarkable settlement. A few months after the banquet, a short, handwritten letter arrived from Patricia. It said simply that she had been wrong about the house and wrong about my place in the company all those years, and that she didn't expect a reply. She only wanted me to know it. I didn't write back right away. Eventually, I sent her a plain card wishing her well after a hip surgery I'd heard about through a mutual friend. Forgiveness didn't erase what had happened. It simply meant I no longer wanted to carry the weight of it into whatever years I had left. People sometimes ask whether winning ever felt as satisfying as I'd imagined it would, back when I was still sitting alone at that kitchen table with a cold bowl of soup. Honestly, it didn't. Not in the way I expected. Watching Derek lose his title didn't heal me. Selling the Greenwich house back into someone's loving care didn't heal me. Standing at that podium didn't heal me, not entirely. What actually healed me was something quieter. Finally understanding that I no longer needed to earn respect from people who had already decided long ago never to give it to me. If you've ever built something extraordinary while someone else quietly took the credit for it, I hope you already know this. Your name belongs on that history too. It always did.